White man calls cops on black teen, then freezes when his powerful father arrives. The gunmetal flash of police lights split the bayou dusk, painting Malaya Carter's brown skin in bruised shades of red and blue. She stood alone, 15 years old, a backpack sagging from her shoulder, caught like a deer beneath a hunter's rifle. The squad car doors slammed open, boots hit the asphalt, and suspicion unfurled faster than the humid Louisiana wind. In South Bayou Ridge, danger didn't always shout. It crept behind lace curtains. It whispered through rusting rocking chairs. Walter Sims watched from his sagging porch, the phone still warm in his hand, the word suspicious still bitter on his tongue. Long after the sirens faded, the stillness clung to the town, thick as the August heat, sharp as broken glass. Behind closed windows, faces half hidden, hearts half closed, the ridge watched, but did not move. And when Marcus Carter's truck rumbled onto Hawthorne Street, dust swirling around his boots, he didn't bring anger or apology. He got a presence heavier than history, steadier than the weight of silence. That night, Bayou Ridge was not torn by violence. It was split wide open by a choice, to see or to keep looking away. The weight of suspicion fell heavier than the August heat, clinging to Malaya Carter's skin like a second invisible bruise. The flashing red and blue lights didn't just slice through the bayou dusk. They branded her, a 15-year-old girl walking home with a backpack of groceries and a battered geometry textbook. From a porch sagging under the weight of old fears, Walter Sims watched, his hand trembling slightly over the phone he had just used to summon a threat that wasn't there. The squad car doors burst open with a violence louder than the cicadas. Officers moved in quickly and practiced, their hands hovering near their holsters before a word was even spoken. Malaya froze, every muscle taut from a father's long talks about how to survive being seen in the wrong way, in the wrong place. The gravel under her sneakers seemed to hum with the history of every soul who had stood like this before her, waiting to be judged without ever being heard. And just when it felt like the air might collapse her lungs, a low rumble broke across the street, the steady, fearless sound of Marcus Carter's truck. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He stepped from the cab with the slow, unstoppable certainty of a man who had fought both fire and prejudice and was not about to lose his daughter to either. His presence bent the charged air between flashing lights, not through anger, but through a dignity so fierce it refused to bow. In that suspended moment, a father and daughter stood against the weight of history and began to rewrite it. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above them, casting a tired glow over the worn oak table where Marcus and Malaya Carter sat, the silence between them louder than any siren. Malaya hunched over her glass of sweet tea, the ice long since melted into a lukewarm pool. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the calluses on his hands catching the light like old battle scars. He oversaw his daughter, knowing the wounds she carried now were the kind no bandage could cover. "You scared out there tonight?" he asked finally, his voice rough but not unkind. Malaya shrugged, the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders. "I did everything right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I stayed calm. I showed my hands. I answered their questions. And still..." Her words trailed off, leaving the unspoken hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't enough. Marcus exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man lets out when he knows no easy words will fix what's broken. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his own, steady and sure. "You did right," he said. "You did more than right. But sometimes, baby girl, The truth ain't about you. It's about the fear in their eyes." Malaya looked up, her eyes swimming with anger and confusion. "Then what's the point?" she asked. "Why even try?" Marcus's smile was slight, but iron strong. "Because we're not just surviving," he said. "We're teaching. We're building. We're living proof that no matter how heavy the world presses down, it cannot unmake who we are." In the quiet hum of that worn-out kitchen, beneath a roof patched and repatched through storms both natural and artificial, father and daughter forged something unbreakable, not just resilience, but a defiant kind of hope. The next morning, the ridge woke slower than usual, as if the weight of last night's sirens had seeped into the soil. Porch swings that once rocked lazily stood still. Screen doors creaked open a crack, then closed again. Malaya Carter walked to Carter's Market with her head high, a simple paper bag clutched to her chest, and every step carved a new line into the sidewalks worn by generations before her. From across the street, Mrs. Henderson paused, watering her hydrangeas, her hand trembling slightly around the hose. She offered a tight, uncertain smile, one that tried too hard to be casual, too late to erase the memory of how quickly fear had spread. Down the block, Mr. Coleman, who once ruffled Malaya's hair when she was 6, shifted his weight behind the screen door, guilt sitting heavy on his stooped shoulders. The ridge wasn't shouting hate today. It was whispering shame. Walter Sims sat on his porch, in the same cracked chair, the same brittle pride. But something was different in the way he watched her now. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to reckoning, slow and raw. He knew deep down that no apology, no neighborly wave could undo the call he had made, the way he had summoned history to replay itself at the expense of a 15-year-old girl. Malaya didn't flinch. She didn't glance away. Her steps stayed sure, her spine straight, every inch of her a quiet, burning testament that she would not carry their guilt for them. And in the heavy, humid hush of that small southern town, the first cracks formed, not in Malaya, but in the walls the ridge had built around itself for far too long. When Malaya Carter stepped through the wide double doors of Bayou Ridge High, a hush seemed to ripple down the hallways, not loud enough to be called silence, but sharp enough to be felt. The clatter of lockers, the buzz of morning chatter, all of it dimmed under the invisible weight she carried on her shoulders. It wasn't the backpack tugging at her spine. It was the way eyes flickered toward her, and then away, like moths afraid of the flame. Some faces showed stiff nods of recognition. Others held the strained politeness of people who had seen injustice, but decided it wasn't theirs to claim. A few, braver or perhaps guiltier, offered awkward smiles, shallow as puddles on a dry street. And then there were the stares, curious, cautious, measuring her as if last night's sirens still echoed around her name. Malaya kept her steps even, her gaze steady. She walked the same cracked tile floors she had crossed every day for years, but today they felt different, almost foreign, as if she had crossed an unseen border overnight. In Mr. Langston's English class, the lesson on American ideals, liberty, justice, equality, scraped against the rawness inside her like sandpaper on fresh skin. She answered when called on, her voice firm, her words chosen carefully, planting small seeds of truth where she could. Later, sitting alone under the sprawling oak in the courtyard, Malaya felt the heavy hush settle again. But she didn't shrink. She lifted her chin, drew a slow breath, and made a silent promise to herself. She would not be defined by fear, nor would she let them carry the easy comfort of forgetting. And as you sit with her story now, ask yourself, When history passes by your front door, will you watch from the window, or will you step out and meet it? Walter Sims sat on his porch the following evening, the same worn chair groaning under his weight, the same cracked coffee mug cooling on the rail beside him. But tonight, the hum of the bayou sounded different. It wasn't the cicadas or the low whine of mosquitoes. It was the restless stirring of something long buried inside him. He had lived on Hawthorne Street for 68 years, through hurricanes, harvests, and brutal winters, believing he had come to understand this place, its people, and his role in it. But watching Malaya Carter walk past his porch again, head high, steps sure, struck something more profound than he wanted to admit. He remembered a time when he had carried a lunchbox to the mills, working alongside men of every color, sweating and laughing together, because survival left no room for suspicion. Somewhere along the way, that hard-earned brotherhood had eroded into cautious glances and slow, silent divides. Walter sipped his coffee and stared into the gathering dusk. He thought of the call he had made, how easily the words "suspicious individual" had fallen from his mouth, how easily he had mistaken presence for threat. Shame coiled slow and thick in his chest, heavier than guilt, because it wasn't just about Malaya. It was about every moment he had let fear speak louder than decency. Across the street, Carter's Market glowed under its hand-painted sign, a stubborn beacon in a town that sometimes forgot how to welcome its own. Walter set his coffee down and stood, his joints aching from disuse, from hesitation. For the first time in a long time, he crossed his porch step without knowing exactly what he would say, only that silence, too, was a kind of betrayal he could no longer afford. The folding chairs in the small church hall groaned under the weight of old bodies and older grievances. The smell of coffee, overbrewed and burnt, hung heavy in the air as neighbors shuffled in, some with arms crossed, some with faces tight with expectation, others with the cautious hope of people who had seen too many promises broken to trust easily. Marcus Carter stood at the front of the room, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, the other tucked into the pocket of his worn jeans. He didn't pound the podium or raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had spent a lifetime wrestling fires both real and unseen. "I'm not here to point fingers," Marcus began, his voice steady. "I'm here because something broke the other night, and maybe it's been cracked a long time, but now we can't pretend not to see it." The room shifted uneasily, the wooden floorboards creaking under the movement. "My daughter," he said, pausing to let the words settle, "was made to feel like a stranger in her own home. Not by people she didn't know, by people she grew up waving to, by people who once bought lemonade from her stand in the summer." He let that hang in the stale air, heavier than any sermon. "I'm not asking for apologies," Marcus continued. "I'm asking for something harder. I'm asking you to look at yourselves, really look, and ask why a black child carrying groceries feels dangerous enough to call the police." He didn't lecture. He didn't accuse. He stood there, offering them the uncomfortable, necessary mirror of their own making. In the heavy quiet that followed, somewhere deep in the marrow of that old church, the first seeds of reckoning began to take root. The auditorium buzzed with the low murmur of 1,000 restless teenagers, the smell of new programs and nervous excitement thick in the air. Malaya Carter stood backstage, her palms damp against the worn wooden podium, waiting for her out there, under a halo of hot lights. Just months ago, she was a girl dodging sidelong glances in her hometown. Now, she had been invited to speak before a statewide youth summit on leadership and change. As she waited, she could hear snippets of the speaker before her, a boy from Baton Rouge, talking about river cleanup initiatives. And she smiled, a small, steady thing. Change can be messy, slow, and almost invisible, but it can happen. She was proof of that. When her name was called, Malaya stepped into the light. The faces before her, a sea of possibilities. She took a slow breath, letting the moment settle into her bones. "I'm not here because I am brave," she began, her voice clear, carrying to the rafters. "I'm here because silence costs too much." She told them about Hawthorne Street, about walking home carrying nothing more dangerous than a geometry book and a can of peaches, about what it felt like to stand in the crosshairs of history's unfinished business. Then she paused, scanning the young faces turned toward her. "When the time comes," she asked, voice softer now, but no less steady, "will you be the one who calls out injustice, or the one who pretends not to see it?" The room held its breath, and Malaya, standing tall in the spotlight, understood something powerful. The future wasn't some distant thing waiting to arrive. It was already here, sitting shoulder to shoulder, waiting for someone to light the match. The old playground behind Carter's Market had once been little more than a cracked basketball court and a rusting jungle gym. Grass had pushed stubbornly through the asphalt, and the only sounds most afternoons were the idle buzz of flies and the distant hum of passing trucks. But change, Malaya had learned, doesn't always arrive like a hurricane. Sometimes it comes one shovel, one paintbrush, one shared idea at a time. It started small, just Malaya and a few classmates, a stack of flyers, and an afternoon spent convincing skeptical neighbors to donate leftover paint, spare lumber, even old swings buried in backyard sheds. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but others, watching Malaya's fierce determination, reached for their toolboxes without another word. Saturdays became work days. Kids from both sides of town, who had once barely nodded at each other in the hallways, hammered planks side by side. Fathers who hadn't spoken in years found themselves passing buckets of nails and trading quiet stories under the shade of a newly raised pavilion. Mothers lined the chain-link fence with lemonade stands and folding chairs, their laughter carrying across the breeze. Malaya stood back one afternoon, paint-streaked and sunburned, watching as the ridge, her ridge, stitched itself together with every swing bolted into place, every hand reaching out without suspicion. It wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about building something bigger than fear, something stubborn and beautiful enough to outlast the mistakes that had come before. And when she picked up her hammer again, Malaya knew. This wasn't just rebuilding a playground. It was rebuilding trust, one board, one bridge, one brave step at a time. Marcus Carter stood at the back of Carter's Market after closing, the soft clinking of glass bottles being stacked and the low thrum of an old radio filling the empty aisles. He wiped his hands on a ragged towel, his mind slipping into memories that clung tighter than the Louisiana humidity outside. He remembered being a boy no older than Malaya, walking home from Little League in a town just like the Ridge, the sun still clinging to the edge of the world. He had worn his uniform proudly, dust and sweat, and a smile he hadn't yet learned to guard. That night, 2 squad cars pulled alongside him. They hadn't asked where he was going. They hadn't asked his name. They had only ordered him to the ground, face pressed into the gravel, the new glove his father had saved all winter to buy slipping from his hand. Marcus had learned then what his coaches hadn't taught him, that no amount of hard work, no jersey, no trophy could scrub suspicion from his skin. Years later, he had carried those lessons into adulthood, not with bitterness, but with a fierce kind of patience. He had joined the fire department, rebuilt homes after hurricanes, run Carter's market with fairness and grit, always choosing to stitch himself deeper into the fabric of the town that once looked at him sideways. Now, as he listened to Malaya laughing out front with friends who were painting signs for the new playground, Marcus realized something he hadn't dared to believe as a boy lying in the dirt. Maybe, just maybe, the ground was shifting beneath them, not by force, but by the steady, stubborn steps of those who refused to be pushed down anymore. The acceptance letter sat on the kitchen table like a small, shining sun, its crisp envelope already worn soft at the edges from being handled so many times. Malaya Carter stared at it, the words dancing in her mind. Scholarship, leadership program, future. Outside the screen door, Carter's market bustled with its familiar chorus. Mrs. Henderson, bargaining over tomatoes. Mr. Coleman, laughing with the boys fixing the playground fence. Life in Bayou Ridge hummed forward, steady and strong, stitched together by years of good intentions and new beginnings. Marcus Carter leaned against the counter, arms folded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His pride filled the room as surely as the smell of fresh bread baking in the back ovens. Malaya traced the embossed crest of the university with her fingertips, feeling the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a promise. She thought of the sirens, the porch lights flickering behind closed curtains, the way the ground had once felt so uncertain beneath her feet. And she thought of how she had stood tall anyway, how her community, fractured but mending, had chosen to stand with her. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her backpack alongside her notebooks and dreams, and stepped out into the bright, heavy air of a Louisiana morning. The road ahead would not be easy. Change never was. But it was hers now, paved not just by hope, but by every hard-won step, every quiet act of courage, every voice that refused to be silenced. And as she walked toward her future, Malaya knew. The story of Bayou Ridge was still being written, and this time her hands would help hold the pen. Sometimes the quietest choices define us more than the loudest words. Marcus Carter chose dignity over anger. Malaya chose hope over fear. And the town of Bayou Ridge, in its slow, stumbling way, chose change over comfort. If you stood in their place, what would your choice be? Would you shield? Would you stand? Would you heal? These moments are not just stories. They are mirrors, held up for each of us to see who we are and who we might yet become. If this story resonated with you, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join us on our journey through more stories. I genuinely welcome your thoughts in the comments. Every word you share is a spark that keeps these stories alive and growing. Thank you for letting this story sit with you for a while, and maybe, just maybe, letting it change the way you see the world.